This episode is part 1 of The Way of the Rabbit, which discusses methods outside of fighting for dealing with a self-defense situation. I've long been a fan of US superhero comic books. When I was a kid in the 1980s, I received a hardback book with a collection of various single Marvel comic strip stories. The book included what must count as one of my favourite all-time single episodes in comic book history, Uncanny X-Men number 213. The story, called Psylocke, sees the X-Men's most popular member, Wolverine, take on Sabretooth in a rematch from the previous issue. At the beginning of their brutal matchup, there is some dialogue, typical of the comic's writer Chris Claremont. Sabretooth, the villain of the piece, growls at his opponent, "You gonna play this straight, boy, or rabbit like last time?" To which Wolverine replies, "Make a move, find out." It's classic mid-1980s melodrama, but the insulting rabbit metaphor stuck with me. Rabbits are synonymous with running away from threats. Years later, when my martial arts training brought me back to the earnest business of studying the application of self-protection in the real world, I noted that playing rabbit, the sound of ice that often fell on less than rabbit-like ears. One of the surprisingly difficult truths to explain to individuals outside of the typical self-defense subculture is the strategic, logical, and moral value of not fighting in an antagonistic situation. I don't just mean simply backing down from a fight challenge or picking one's battles wisely, but what has become popularly known as the art of fighting without fighting. Bruce Lee famously created a scene in Enter the Dragon where he humiliates a bully on a boat by saying that his style of fighting is the art of fighting without fighting. He tells the bully he will show him the style on a nearby island. The bully gets into a rowing boat, expecting Lee to follow him over to the island. Instead, our hero sets the little boat free from the larger boat, putting the man at his immediate mercy. The story was an adaptation from a famous and probably apocryphal anecdote taken from the life of one of Japan's most celebrated samurai duelists and warriors, Bokoden Tsukara. Bokoden was born and died during the Sengoku period when Japan was fighting some of its most fierce civil wars. He had a highly distinguished career with huge numbers of deaths attributed to both his individual duels and success in battle. The simple fact that he died at the ripe age of 82 of natural causes during that extremely violent period, despite having a fearsome reputation, is a fair argument for his fighting abilities. Yet in later years he apparently became known for propagating Mutikatsu-ryu, the school of winning without hands. Our media, folklore and classical literature is full of stories of people victoriously defeating various enemies that need not have been fought in the first place. However, the martial arts world isn't really any better. Much like awareness and understanding the legal side of self-defense, the importance of avoiding fights is given lip service. This has become the "don't try this at home" equivalent disclaimer for martial artists with violent pasts. Consider the comparison with a reformed gangster who enters the music or acting world, and there have been a fair few, who have attracted attention through their notorious pasts. Now they feel compelled to tell those who might come under their influence that crime is not the right way. One can easily see such people, whether they are battle-scarred fighters or ex-criminals, as being insincere in their preaching. I have long had discussions with friends who work professionally dealing with violence and now teach self-defense, and are struggling with whether they are glorifying their past for self-promotion or using it to provide validation for the lessons they are teaching. I've also met fighters and teachers who have completely opted out of providing any moral justification for what they teach. One combat sport teacher told me, when he was discussing handling aggressive people in the world outside the cage or ring, "Sometimes you just got to give them a good dig." Although I could not condone this view, it provided some refreshing honesty amidst a lot of the sanctimony and hypocrisy I've been hearing at the time. Our mythology is shaped by heroic duels and brave battles fought against malicious opponents. When someone behaves like a physical bully, there's a natural desire to see that person be squarely dealt back the violence he delivers. Think of the typical martial arts and action hero trope, where the protagonist does everything to avoid a fight, only to eventually be forced to do just that to defeat the main antagonist. Usually the trope doesn't finish with our hero being presented as the loser for failing to maintain his decision not to use violence, but is celebrated for taking down the bully. One wonders how much of the reluctant fighter-hero story is designed to assuage our guilt for enjoying the violent spectacle. Compare this to the hero of the revenge thriller. Like a public executioner, the hero is cheered on by his or her audience as they exact a personal justice. The revenge thriller is a lightweight variation of the Elizabethan revenge tragedy. This genre, which has its roots in the ancient dramas of Seneca, delivers the message that violent revenge, however justifiable, always destroys far more than the original wrongdoer, and these plays always ended with the hero dying after exacting justice. Again, we're expected to cheer on the hero, yet morally accept the spiritual debt he had to pay for effectively playing God. Our conscience was clear in our enjoyment of the dramatized bloodletting, provided we understood the spiritual message. If we are to be a bit more cynical, on a base level, audiences get a double hit of titillation. They revel in the gory violence, yet get a tearjerker at the same time. Across the ages, little regard is placed on those who choose to run from a conflict or comply with their antagonist's demands. Embedded in our stories is the notion that somehow the force of good will shine brightly on the righteous. Ancient Germanic tribal law fully realized this concept as a divine truth in their trial by combat judicial method, and yet survival has often favored those who are masters at aversive tactics, use cunning, use diplomacy, are master tricksters, and have good escaping skills. Few species of animals have so famously come to symbolize these survivalist traits as the rabbit. The European rabbit alone flourishes in every continent in the world except for Antarctica. The expression breed like rabbits is an apt simile, and what we recognize as a good reason for the survival of the species. Being a common prey animal to so many predators, the rabbit is the consummate survivor. He has a variety of hiding places, which includes the underground network of tunnels known as a warren. The animal has incredibly acute hearing, and being a social creature, has a system of warning fellow rabbits. The rabbit's fleet-footedness is represented in a range of different media. The story of the Chinese zodiac puts it that the rabbit would have easily won the race to the Jade Emperor if he hadn't been so overconfident as to take a nap just before he arrived. Interestingly, the rabbit's cousin the hare also loses his race to the tortoise when he makes the same arrogant assumption in Aesop's fable of ancient Greece. Rabbit certainly features a lot in my childhood stories. Despite being a dog, pony, and monkey trainer and born into a dynasty known for working with tigers, lions, leopards, and other large carnivores, my mother always had a particular fondness for rabbits. She often told me they were the only thing she could draw, which was then demonstrated with her signature ditty of a half-moon shape bordered by 2 ears and surrounding a cottontail. Alison Utley's little grey rabbit was charming enough with her tidiness and sense of responsibility for those very early years of my life, but looking back, her tales were more nostalgic British allegories for bygone days when countryside folk lived simpler lives than an adventurous celebration of the rabbit survivalist. Human society has a bittersweet relationship with rabbits. The wild species has been used as a source for food, clothing, or sport, but they've also been viewed as pests to farmers and gardeners. The elusive and prolific rabbit that raids vegetable patches is seen as a thief. Set this off against the domesticated rabbit status as a popular pet, and the image of the lovable rogue begins to form in the minds of storytellers. These characters are, at the very least, Byronic heroes, often with no moral justification for their thieving and mischief, but sympathetic to the reader because of their success against so many stronger enemies. Beatrix Potter's Peter Rabbit is not particularly clever, but was more of an agile chancer who relied on his primal instinct. However, he was not averse to playing a prank on one occasion. He got out of scrapes because of his agility, help from others, and even dumb luck. The next rabbit hero I could really get my milk teeth into was master trickster himself, Brer Rabbit. Beatrix Potter's stories, starting with Peter Rabbit, were apparently influenced by the works of Joel Chandler Harris, who was the first person to publish Brer Rabbit stories. He framed these using a fictional narrator character called Uncle Remus. The stories were folk tales Harris said he had first heard between 1862 and 1866 on the Turner Plantation slave quarters. Harris, who was working as an apprentice to a printer of a Confederate newspaper, spent a lot of time with the plantation slaves and memorized the folk tales he heard. However, besides the fact that both Potter and Harris's tales feature anthropomorphic rabbits who narrowly escape getting eaten by predators, there is little similarity between them. I remember avidly listening to Brer Rabbit stories as a child, and eventually revisited them many times throughout my childhood, later rereading every single Enid Blyton adaptation to my daughter. Brer Rabbit was often not only the target for many different bullies in the story, which were all natural predatory animals, but also was often on the fringes of animal society. If I was to wax psychological, I might consider that we, as circus people, could relate to him for being both an entertaining trickster and an outsider. Brer Rabbit, it has been argued, was either originally created in North African culture or within the American Cherokee tradition. One can see how themes from their respective folklore are reflected in Brer Rabbit's escapades. Like many good folklore heroes, The rabbit is humanized by his flaws that often get him into trouble. However, the tales are celebrations of brain over brawn. Brer Rabbit outwits his enemies to get what he wants, but he also uses his guile and cunning to escape sticky situations and occasionally to defend other vulnerable creatures. Although most of the stories present rather absurd and unrealistic tactics, they do present core observations on how to manipulate a bully and the need to apply one's wits in an emergency situation. When teaching children self-protection soft skills, you can do a lot worse than quoting a streetwise underdog like Brer Rabbit. Then there's Bugs Bunny, Warner Brothers' most recognizable and successful original creation. Few children are immune to this rabbit hero, who does what all great rabbit icons do and outwits bullies. His world may be the crazy and surrealistic comedy domain of the Looney Tunes, and Bugs might take many of his trademark mannerisms from the great wisecracking clown Groucho Marx, but he's still a celebration of the survivalist trickster. His enemies are either larger and stronger than him, or they're armed, such as his two main antagonists, the determined hunter Elmer Fudd, or the fiery-tempered gunslinger Yosemite Sam. Bugs adapts to and works the crazy world in which he exists like a professional, and uses his wits throughout to eventually succeed over the often impossible odds he's given. Even a Bugs Bunny cartoon can be a lesson in self-protection. Perhaps one of the greatest explorations of the self-defense rabbit icon can be found in Richard Adams's Watership Down. My daughter was steadily introduced to the novel, an animated feature film, as a fable about resourcefulness, courage, being streetwise, even in the country, and facing the harsh realities of the world. This novel recreates the Brer Rabbit character as a mythical prince of his species called Elihara, and Adams puts him, along with the sun god Frith, at the centre of an invented rabbit religion and culture. Throughout the book's story, which deals with a group of enterprising rabbits that fled their doomed warren to start their own, and then free other rabbits from an oppressive military dictatorship, one rabbit tells didactic stories about their folkloric hero. The first story told, which became the pre-credit sequence from the 1978 adaptation of the novel, is a creation tale that sets down the universal philosophy of the rabbit. Here, Elihara is punished for refusing to control his species' prolific breeding by Frith, who condemns them to a lifetime of facing predators. Once the god has granted many of the other animals with a desire to eat rabbits and the weapons to do the job, he gives the rabbits physical attributes to aid them in their escape. However, above all else, he provides the following advice to Elihara. All the world will be your enemy, prince with 1,000 enemies, and whenever they catch you, they will kill you. But first they must catch you, digger, listener, runner, prince with the swift warning. Be cunning and full of tricks, and your people
will never be destroyed.
With fighting being the last resort of all intelligent self-protection students and teachers, we owe it to ourselves and all those who wish to positively influence to develop skills that are based on using one's wits to avoid having to fight. There is much that the rabbit, an animal who can rarely rely on its abilities as a fighter, can teach us. The great war strategist Sun Tzu's seminal work, The Art of War, is a common reference point both in martial arts circles and in the macho posturing of business motivation. Along with Musashi Miyamoto's The Book of Five Rings, Sun Tzu's writings appear to lend a type of classical scholarly credence and justification to those who pursue conflict. However, the strategies of Sun Tzu's treatise is largely concerned with winning without actually fighting. When one considers that this work was retained as the lead text of the 7 classics of Chinese literature for 1,500 years, and to this day is considered to be the overall most influential East Asian work on military strategy, it's easy to see why the respected Japanese samurai Bokoden Tsukahara, who we discussed in the previous episode, was not met with scorn when he preached the art of winning with no hands. With Sun Tzu's pragmatic work so entrenched in the minds of generations of military leaders during the heights of China's success as an empire, one can see why it was more than a religion or an inserted morality that would influence martial artists to teach the value of physical fighting only as a last resort. Fighting is costly, especially when good results can be achieved without physically engaging with someone. With its heavy reliance on cunning and trickery, there is much of the way of the rabbit in Sun Tzu's treatise. The art of war might be considered at least as much as wisdom on the alternatives to violence as it is on waging battles. Not only does the author preach the value of evasion against stronger foes, but in his 3rd chapter, which is concerning strategic attack, he says, quote, For to win 100 victories in 100 battles is not the acme of skill. To subdue the enemy without fighting is the acme of skill." End quote. In 1998, martial arts and self-protection teacher Jeff Thompson published his book, The Art of Fighting Without Fighting. Like a modern-day Bokudun Tsukihara, Jeff was already showing strong signs that he had outgrown the limitations of physical self-defense. His previous books, which began with his famous autobiography, Watch My Back, had gone through pressure testing, preemptive striking, punching, close-range striking, kicking, stand-up grappling, a multiple-part series on ground fighting and submissions, and even weight training for the martial artist. For years, he had administered the bitter-tasting pill of understanding the realities of violence. This had included offering a fair critique of the shortcomings of most martial arts training of his day, as well as a debunking of many myths in civilized society regarding the nature of self-defense. He had articulated and stressed the importance of preemptive striking and pressure testing as defining characteristics of effective self-defense. Now with this book, which today can easily be lost amid the large output of other books he produced in the 1990s that focused on single self-protection topics, Jeff concerned himself entirely with methods for avoiding physical fighting. If one looks critically and honestly at self-protection, such a progression in needing to address this area should be of no surprise. In his introduction to the book, Jeff explains why he arrived at this point in his life. He explains that he was once of a mindset where winning violent confrontations with violence was his standard belief in dealing with those who presented a physical threat to him. What had begun as self-therapy to face his own fears of physical confrontations and to test his martial arts training had evolved into a 9-year lifestyle of defending a reputation as a formidable nightclub bouncer working some of the most dangerous doors in the UK. For life-changing reasons outlined and explored in his other work, Jeff left this behind and came to the realization that the highest victory in a self-defense situation is to avoid getting physical. Jeff believes that a lot of insecurity has pushed many a martial arts fighter to get into unnecessary brawls because they felt they had something to prove. It is this belief that has fueled him and many other peaceful warriors to train hard in an area that tests fighting competence to build the inner resolve not to give that certain person a dig, even if they needed one. Jeff's chapters on avoidance and escape begins with simple situation awareness education. Quite simply, exercise common sense and insight to avoid places with bad reputations. Mo Teague neatly described to me the changing factors that raise or lower situational risk as people, places, times and hazards. Reading behaviours in certain people are important skills, as the Brer Rabbit tales often illustrated. We can plan ahead and adapt accordingly if we can see that someone is going to turn violent. 8 years after Jeff's book was published, world boxing champion Ricky Hatton was mugged in China. At the time in his fight career, Hatton was at his prime. He had won multiple versions of the world light welterweight title, and that same year he won the world title in the welterweight division. Yet Hatton, when confronted by a gang of muggers whilst out drinking with friends, had little trouble in handing over a £4,000 Rolex watch. It would have been a fair bet that Hatton would have made short work of any of the muggers in a square go, but in this situation he made the sensible decision in parting with his expensive possession. I often use the anecdote to illustrate the point that if it was good enough for a world boxing champion to decide his life was more important than his ego or a lifeless object, then it should be good enough for the rest of us. Bringing matters closer to home, I often use my daughter as the measure for how self-defense should apply to me. When I teach concepts, strategies or tactics, I think of what I would want her to do. She once asked me the question what I would do if someone threatened me with a weapon and demanded money from me. I replied that I would hand it over, or, if I could, negotiate or escape. She looked a little crestfallen. Her martial arts teaching father, her defender and teacher, did not provide an exciting hypothetical story that compared with what our society has come to expect of its heroes. I then described to her another hypothetical scene. She was visiting me in hospital. There is a heart monitor beeping and tubes sticking out of me. I'm going to need a liver transplant, or I might die. I look at her and say that the reason why I'm here, the reason why I might die, was because I decided to fight someone for my money, or because they insulted me. I asked her if she thought that it would be worth it, and if I would have made her proud. As you can see, bedtime stories in the club household have moved on a little since Peter and Brer Rabbit now. Anyway, we then went through a list of other reasons why I could have ended up in that situation, and in the end, the only one she could feel proud about was if the situation I put myself in danger was, if it had been a failed attempt to protect myself, or if I'd tried to protect someone else. We all have our moral compasses. Sometimes, looking at the worst case situation helps bring that into perspective. It is this attitude that should back up the defense strategy. You put up a barrier to those who you fear will harm you, and it should be enough to dissuade a fair number of people on a social level. Others might need this barrier to be reinforced by other non-physical tactics. This can range from simply stating you don't want trouble, or using a range of conflict management skills that might give a simply aggrieved aggressor time to cool down. There are a number of ways that this can be achieved. If this is an incident with a stranger, then playing the submissive party that makes the antagonist feel that he has already won is not the worst of ideas. Non-strangers, or at least people that you're likely to be seeing again, are a different matter. Such submissiveness might turn you into a regular victim of their bullying. Here you might try more sophisticated manipulation techniques such as humour, or even Gavin de Becker's forced teaming. Mutual laughter is a natural and powerful stress reliever that humans are grateful for when it arrives. Turning enemies into friends isn't just pacifist idealism, it is the art of the professional diplomat. From Persians to Romans to Mongolians, many a conquering nation understood they had a better chance of sustainability if they could balance their aggression with diplomacy. Assertion is another method that can apply to both strangers and non-strangers effectively. Just as the submissive posturing is a method for hiding your preemptive strike if required, assertion must be used with the full intention that you are prepared to draw your metaphorical katana out in full. Likewise, understanding pre-attack ritual is a vital part of self-protection education. Seeing a person posture might give you an indication whether or not he's going to advance on you. Arm splaying, head pecking, finger beckoning and gesticulating are classic aggressive display behaviours, but they do not always lead to an assault. Indeed, in many cases they are merely being used instead of actual fighting. Recognizing this going on without the aggressor stepping forward into your space or touching your fence should indicate that a fight is avoidable. Jeff Thompson and his old-school door supervising mentor, John Awesome Anderson, had a type of aggressive fence they would use that involved being preemptive, but at the same time was not intended to knock their target out or be followed by a volley of hard strikes. This was a sharp shove that created a large gap and was immediately reinforced by posturing and aggressive commands, which was designed to prompt the chemical cocktail or hormone release in the would-be attacker's body that would deter him from stepping forward. With the exception of violent sociopaths and psychopaths, all of us have a bit of the metaphorical running rabbit in our DNA. The survival of any species relies on an individual not engaging in avoidable life-threatening risk. The real rabbit does not appear to have developed much in the way of a deterrent to its thousand enemies, or ill, if we're using the language of Richard Adams. And although rabbits have little problem fighting if they have to, much of their survival evolution is down to their excellent methods of escape. Like humans, they're social animals and have many different means for signalling warnings to their fellow rabbits about predatory danger. Foot thumping, for example, is an effective signal for rabbits above or below ground of approaching danger. Having a network of burrows in their underground warrens with various entrances is also a useful escape tool. Likewise, the trained self-defense student should become proficient in both recruiting allies and spotting useful exit points in any given situation. There are many case studies where victims of murderous criminals have escaped with their lives thanks to the use of their wits. A combination of forced teaming techniques that will at very least stall their captor have brought them time to devise an exit strategy. When the moment has been right, they have made a break for it. In addition to teaching good verbal skills and understanding pre-attack behaviours, it's important that serious self-defense students are taught effective escaping. Teaching children has really highlighted this for me. Even the best trained child faces odds the average able-bodied adult does not have to contend with when it comes to fighting a violent adult. Therefore, tactical running, handling obstacles, and hiding should be part of the foundation skills for any child's self-defense course, and this should further inform adults. Some adults have taken this on board in a serious manner. Although there is no consensus opinion on its exact origin, the art of movement, parkour, was probably a development of military obstacle courses. Given its connection to these courses and the fact that one of its forerunners included combat as part of its training program, parkour might be considered to be a form of non-physical martial art. These days, we see its evolution to a form of physical expression, a form of improvised gymnastics, but at its root you can see the art of escape. When I warm up my clients to engage in a combat sport, I use movements they will employ and should be part of their fundamentals when we train techniques, drills and spar. You will know by now that I'm not a fan of wasted warm-ups using movements that are not directly related to the activity that is to be practiced. Stand-up fighters work on their footwork and head movement, clinchers train their level shifting, shoots and sprawls, and ground fighters crawl, snake or shrimp their way along the mats. Self-defense students might use parts of these warm-ups to train muscle memory for combatives, but they should also train to run to real exit points at a split-second notice, to run serpentine or in a zigzag, to jump, scale and duck under obstacles, and to avoid one another in a mass rush. Another great attribute of the rabbit is his advanced hearing. We cannot hear as well as a rabbit or many other of our fellow mammals, but we can train to understand how auditory exclusion works. Therefore, it's important that various exercises are devised to increase pressure and to create the conditions where auditory exclusion will occur. Although shutting out noise might be a very important part of trying to focus in a dangerous situation, it can also work against us. We need to drill taking notice between exerting short and fast bursts of energy under pressure. The rabbit remains an icon of street smarts, or country smarts if you will, over brawn. Because he's the prince with 1,000 enemies, he provides us and our children with a strong metaphor of survival against bullies. Small wonder that those who are oppressed, such as the Cherokee or the Western African slaves, would find solace in the stories of Brer Rabbit. His stories and others such as Watership Down, Peter Rabbit or even Bugs Bunny might teach us that the world is a violent place, but we don't have to be the biggest, strongest and most fearsome fighter to survive and thrive. A monument to Brer Rabbit can be seen in Eatonton, Georgia, where Joel Chandler Harris first heard the stories of this rascally hero at the Turnwood Plantation. Under the statue of a smartly dressed Brer Rabbit, there are words that are particular to this character, but also speak to us of the value of what the likes of experienced fighters such as Bokoden Tsukahara concluded in later years. The words begin with, "Born and bred in the briar patch," a reference to a reverse psychology trick our hero plays on his main antagonist, Brer Fox, when he convinces the villain to throw him into a briar patch and allow him to escape. The final line says it all for the art of fighting without fighting. He survives forever by his wit, his courage, and his cunning.